So today I'm going to hopefully help everyone understand a little bit about Zero Trust architecture and a little bit of background on what today's session or my goals are is really understanding the marketing versus what theoretical Zero Trust means. And while that sounds boring, theoretical, it's actually quite interesting because what's old is now new again. And so we'll go through all the strategies outlined by some of the industry analysts and also try to cut through the marketing buzzwords and really talk about the core of what Zero Trust architecture is really about. Just for the record, so no one leaves immediately, this is not a product pitch. We're going to talk about Zero Trust from an organizational standpoint and how we actually want to achieve Zero Trust. And a little bit about me. So as was mentioned, I'm a principal architect at Cisco, and I work mostly with customers. I do have the unofficial title of Integrations Enforcer. I'm a big believer of architecture as an enabler for organizations to get outcomes. You know, one point product or the super silver bullet doesn't exist, and how we actually put things together matters quite a bit. Been doing cybersecurity for 15 years. Couple fun facts. One, I am very cold. At least I got to see a little bit of snow, so that's helpful. Two, I've done a couple of books on access control and these topics that are out there. And three, most of the architecture I try to live and breathe and test. So my actual home power bill probably equates to about a super target's power bill. Wife does not like it, but that's how we live. So let's talk a little bit about traditional security architecture and really where we've come from, you know, over the past 15, 20 years. And most of you should hopefully be aware of this model, which is kind of the castle and having a strong perimeter or trust boundary. And so for many, many years, we look at organizations and how we protect those organizations, and it's the castle with the moat. So if I'm inside the castle, I'm trusted. If I'm outside the castle, I'm untrusted. And that castle wall acts as the perimeter for my organization or for my people that are there. And what this leads to is the bad guys got pretty smart pretty quickly. And so they looked at the age-old issue and they said, well, just like we saw many, many years ago, I can insert or get into the castle with pretty much ease nowadays. And so this changing landscape's really changed the way that security professionals have looked at how we secure organizations. And this perimeter-based approach really isn't working the way that people want it to. And the best example is, I don't care which study you look at, but just phishing by itself. On average, it's 12% click rate for phishing emails. Doesn't matter what organization you do work for. It doesn't matter if you train your end users once a week, once a month, once a year. 12% of your organizational users are going to click on that bad link. And what does this lead to? Really, when we trust too much in an organization and we look at protecting with that old perimeter-based approach, it makes it very easy for the bad guy. And the bad guy can sit there and do his recon, be able to deliver some form of phish that's very targeted. A lot of my favorite examples are HR emails, job-related emails, training-related emails that will get that person to click on that link. And essentially, once I have one machine within an organization, most organizations allow inherent trust inside that perimeter. So just like the castle, I'm able to laterally move from one machine to another machine very quickly. And as I look at this as a bad guy, my goal is to do password harvesting, be able to gather as much information about the organization and pivot to the DC where I can then take and exfiltrate data back to myself. Now the best example of this, how many of you have heard of NotPetya? Okay, about 3/4, good. Some of the larger customers out there, and it's very, very public, you go read some of the articles, Wired did a great article. When we look at this process, the end result in this picture was being able to take information out. In the ransomware example, it was encrypting all of those machines And when we think about human interaction in this topology, in this drawing, the amount of machines that NotPetya was able to take ownership of, install ransomware in, a lot of the examples are 10,000 machines in less than 10 minutes. So I don't care how fast your SOC is, I don't care how fast you can write firewall rules, no one can stop something that quickly within an organization. And so that's kind of what we're up against. And so Zero Trust, by default, kind of started a long time ago. And hopefully you've been watching it over the years. But in 2004, there was this thing called the Jericho Forum, where a bunch of CISOs got together and they talked about how they can do security a little bit differently. And they focused on this concept of castle and the perimeter and not making that so the number one facet of security. And so in 2004, we saw that. In 2010, the first industry analyst came out with the word Zero Trust. And this was done by the analyst at Forrester. And so he came out and said, hey, this is Zero Trust. It was all about deperimeterization, being able to really focus on moving the resources and the protection from the perimeter inside the organization a little bit deeper. And then about 2014, we saw a lot of additional things. Google was actually the first public example of a real Zero Trust architecture in action. Now, the funny part about that story is in order for Google to do it, it was 7 years, millions and millions of dollars of investment and custom coding to actually make Zero Trust real. And we'll talk about it a little bit more. With Forrester in 2017, they kind of went from their original 3 facets of Zero Trust and expanded upon it and added 3 new ones. At the same time, Gartner came out with this model called CARTA, and we'll talk about that. And now kind of leads us into today. So today, Zero Trust architecture has been very generalized, and realistically, the interest, because of breaches like NotPetya, because of what organizations are facing, the interest has gone extremely big. Now, I'll ask a question to you. If this thing's been around for, 14, 15 years, why haven't organizations adopted it? Cost and difficulty. So when we start looking at this thing, it's not easy. And so marketing's not going to solve the issue for you. Actually being able to automate and be able to take the journey of Zero Trust and make it real for the organization is kind of critical. And we'll talk about really what that means. And so if you don't take anything away from all the different models and industry analysts, just remember this basic tenet, which is when we say Zero Trust, we're talking about ubiquitous least privilege access. And so anyone who knows firewalls or routers with access control lists understands that in general, we have a implicit deny at the end and a bunch of permits. This is what we mean by least privilege. If we have a implicit permit inside the organization, that is not least privilege. So again, if you look at 1998 security best practices coming up from the US NSA, least privilege is in there. It's not a new concept. Zero Trust is all about applying least privilege in a meaningful way. And we'll get to what that really means. Now, if we compare and contrast that fortress model, that hard outer shell of a perimeter with the chewy inside, the traditional approach was all based on creating security based on location, IP addresses, and being able to protect in meaningful ways, but really not get to that least privilege model. With Zero Trust, we're focused on being able to apply trust and context decisions at every access request that takes place within the organization. And then the focus here is to be able to extend that trust across the campus, the WAN, the data center, cloud, every application that's in use. And so if you just think about internet by itself, it starts to get a little scary. It's like, well, how do I create least privilege for access from my users to all the applications that they use on the internet? So we'll start to look at how we make that real and how we can automate some of the the steps involved in this process. Because that's the key here, is that if you try to do this thing manually, it's way too much money, it takes way too much time, and you're kind of left with, well, I'm just going to add a permit at the end and life is good. So before we go any further, I do want to kind of look at the differences between authentication and authorization, because this comes up quite a bit in Zero Trust. Hey, if I authenticate a user, it's the same thing as authorizing their permissions and being able to give them access. Well, that's not really the case. If we look at my buddy Jamie Heary, also another Jamie, kind of look at identifying himself to a bank. So, hey, I'd like $40,000 from Chuck Robbins' account. Do you have identification? Well, yes, here it is. So I'm able to provide ID and identify myself. Now, this is authentication, right? I have a credential, and I'm able to identify myself. The key thing when we get into Zero Trust is being able to do that authorization step. And there is a big difference in technology when you think about authenticated and authorization. So once we realize that, yes, you are indeed who you say you are, and you're coming from a trusted point, we also have to authorize the connections, the states, the packets, everything that goes along with it. In this example, the bank hopefully realizes that this person is not authorized to access money from that account. Now, as we move forward, the other big part of this is actually logging. So I need to be able to understand when any authorization, authentication attempt takes place and be able to monitor and track that over time. And you'll see that in most of the models that we're going to explore is within Zero Trust. First part is about getting policy in place. The second part is about being able to monitor over time. Now, please ask questions as we go. It's a smaller group, so we can interrupt me as you see fit, and we can talk through some of this stuff. Now, in technical terms, hopefully you all have seen the concept of AAA. So we've got authentication, authorization. When we log these things, we're going to pretty generally talk about accounting as that method. Now, once we look at that traditional, we can really start to see where Zero Trust changes this paradigm. And it focuses on the data protection, not on attacks. So you'll hear threat-centric versus trust-centric quite a bit in industry. And as security professionals, we kind of look at threat-centric as the most important thing we do. We want to make sure we keep the bad guys out. We want to stop the threats. When we get into Zero Trust, it's all about the data protection and really focused on who should have access. We're also going to make some general assumptions. Essentially, we're going to look at a network and an environment and assume that everything's already owned and breached. If we assume that everything's hostile, we can also assume that we're not going to allow access until we know for a fact that the user and the device is actually proven trusted. And one of the concepts that people like to joke about is, let me just treat my organization like everyone's on public internet. And once I start to do that, I can see that I'm going to prove with least privilege the user, the device, the status, before I ever allow access. Now, one of the benefits here is once I assume that things are untrusted, you see immediately the requirement to have things like encryption. So I must encrypt all that data because someone's going to be eavesdropping on it. And finally, I need to verify before I trust. And this is really the key takeaway, right? I can't just, because you're in my organization, you successfully connected to my wired network, you should be allowed to enter the data center or access an IoT device. So really flipping that mantra of there is no perimeter, everything's untrusted until proven otherwise. Now, there is a lot of literal definitions within Zero Trust. And one of the fun parts about this is literally, when we look at definitions like this, I always think of this example. I go to the bakery, I ask for a cake, and I say, I'd like for a cake to say, thanks for a great year in purple. And as soon as I do that, I get back a cake that basically says, thanks for a great year in purple. Now, literal means a lot in technology as well. And so one of the things that you have to look at is when we look at some of the models from Forrester, Gartner, Cisco, other industry experts, how the literal definition applies to your organization. And so there's a lot of organizations out there, including public and private sector, that have focused on different models, and they've come up with what makes sense for their organization and what that journey looks like. But if we look at the literal definition, again, it goes back to things like the network is always assumed to be hostile. I'm also, internal is just as important as external threats, and they exist at all times. Every user, device, app, network, flow is authenticated and authorized. Now that's a big one we're gonna come back to, because technically, when we start looking at that literal definition, there's not almost anything in market today that does that literal definition. So we'll keep looking at this. Another one is automated and integrated systems that are gonna allow that architecture to work in real time and in the real world. This is a big part. And then policies have to be dynamic. Now this goes back to that threat use case, right? 10,000 machines, 10,000 or in 10 minutes. We have to have some form of dynamic automation that happens both while generating the actual policy as well as if a threat or breach occurs. And so automation is what's gonna be the big game changer here. The reason why this was so expensive to adopt was someone actually had to go, hey, here's a new application that we're deploying. Here's how that application behaves in the real world. Here are my users that actually need access to the application. And here's the additional context that I need to be able to make an authorization decision prior to opening things up or allowing them. And this is difficult. Like even from a vendor point of view, being able to get to all of these is very difficult when we look at architecture. Now, all activity is logged and accounted for. While it sounds easy, it's actually more difficult than you would think. How many people have some form of ACL that doesn't actually send that record out? Or how about a dropped packet because there's not a route in a routing table? All of that activity in a zero trust world has to be logged and has to be looked at on a consistent basis. And finally, there's two kind of key points here. Trust is earned, number one, and that's going to be earned through context, who, what, when, where, and how. And finally, it is temporary. And when we look at organizations and how we work, temporary is an interesting term. As I come in the morning, I connect my laptop to wireless, everything's good. 10 minutes later, I turn off antivirus because I'm trying to download or play a game. Does my trust change? Is it the same? What tools within an organization can actually accommodate that difference in state and the difference in context over time? And when we start to look at models, this is kind of the visual behind those literal definitions. I look at every user they're owned, device they're owned, data, networks. I can't trust any of it. I have to do this thing in the middle, which is to really provide automated visibility and trust verification. And as a result, my policies go from this IP address should be allowed to access this application or this other network to strictly context-based. I need to know that it's a compliant BYOD iPad with a certain user on a certain group that's trying to pass a non-malicious file, and that entire session is encrypted. And as a result of all of those things, I'm going to allow that transaction to take place. Now, this is light years beyond the normal ACLs that we see. This is getting into being able to really understand end-to-end how applications work and be able to provide a consistent policy for this type of context and criteria. And as I love to say, what's old is new again. You know, the analysts really have done a good job in this market to help define the vendors and define the industry, working directly with customers to understand and position Zero Trust in a meaningful way. And I will joke that everyone looking at these models, while on paper they look very difficult, you're probably already doing Zero Trust in certain areas of your organization. No matter who you are, if you have a firewall, you're doing a portion of Zero Trust. If you're doing application-based authorization within your apps, IT can get to this portion of the app, accounting can get to this portion of the app, that is a piece of Zero Trust. Now, as we deep dive into these different models, you can see over time how they've changed. So in 2010, Forrester came out with their first model around Zero Trust. And the original had 3 tenets and 3 pillars. In 2017, they moved and changed to 3 additional pillars. And those 3 additional pillars really focused on making this a little bit more real and attainable for organizations. Just like the literal definitions kind of seem unreasonable, the models have kind of incorporated the changes in technology to make it actually achievable for most organizations. Now, if we look at the original 3 tenets, it was all about killing the perimeter. Eliminate network trust. I don't care where you're coming from within my network or outside my network. I need to eliminate a location-based trust within my organization. Finally, I need to enforce segmentation across the entire network. And the last piece to this was gain network and visibility analytics. Now, in 2010, this sounds pretty day-to-day operations for most organizations today, but in 2010, a lot of these things really didn't exist for a lot of organizations. Now, as Cisco, obviously we care about these things because how we deal with devices coming onto the network and how we actually achieve these 3 very important goals of Zero Trust, we had to adapt as well, just like most of our customers and organizations had to adapt to these 3 primary pillars. Now, if we step forward, the focus kind of changed. Now, what happened between 2010 and 2017? Some gray cloud thing came about, right? So as cloud adoption, as SaaS adoption happened very, very quickly across the industry, Forrester looked at this thing and said, hey, let's focus on the problem a little bit differently. And so now they focus on these 3 pillars. So people, and that incorporates all types of different users. It could be individual constituents. If I'm a public sector organization, I have my customers are citizens that need to access applications. It could also be workers. We also look at workloads. Now, workload used to be a physical box that sat in a data center. Today, a workload could exist temporarily in a container that's up for 3 microseconds, does its job, and goes down. Doesn't mean I still don't need to focus on that. And then finally, data. So I need to be able to focus on the data and the permissions associated with the data. So everything you see coming out of Forrester today is going to be focused on these 3 pillars. How many of you read Forrester reports, look at Forrester? Okay, just a few. So Forrester really, because they started this thing in 2010, I would say has been working on it a little bit longer than the rest of the industry analysts. We're now seeing things coming out of, for example, NIST has a draft document associated with what they believe Zero Trust is. A lot of the public sector organizations are providing feedback at this time. If you haven't read through it, I encourage you to look at that NIST draft document as well. It's kind of a good follow-up homework assignment from today's session. The other one that everyone's heard of, Gartner? Okay, so on the flip side, Gartner kind of came a little bit later to the game, but at the same time, they added a lot more than just the basic tenets of Zero Trust. So the way they looked at this problem was, it is a continuous thing that I need to perform. And I also need to understand risk associated with my organization alongside trust. So as they looked at the model, it actually goes deeper than some of those literal definitions of Zero Trust, where I'm focused on trustworthiness. Well, they're bringing in this risk equation, which is super important, right? If a device is a high-risk device connecting to an application, I'm going to trust it differently than if it's a patched, fully patched, ready to go, low risk system. And this also incorporates risk associated with the application, with the user, with everything associated with that model or architecture. So there are kind of 5 steps within this CARTA model is, security posture must constantly change, meaning I need to look at this in a continuous basis. I also need to look at the risk and trust score over time. So 1 second I'm okay, the next second I go to a site, I download malware, my machine is no longer trustworthy. I need to be able to incorporate that. Now, within CARTA, one of the challenges you'll see is there is a very stringent or literal definition where you should score and rate all entities. Now, while that is a good goal, and you do see programs out there, like in the US government, we have a small program called CDM. Anyone heard of CDM? No, so continuous diagnostics and monitoring. So the US government actually tried to formalize risk scoring of all assets a while ago. And one of the biggest thing was trying to move away from a point-in-time evaluation where we're doing our scans and doing certification and accreditation once a year to, if things change in 2 weeks, I need to be able to update that scoring. So CDM kind of focuses just on that score and rate all entities on a consistent basis within that Gartner model. Now, finally, we need to shift away from one-time binary decisions. And this is kind of a key point as well, is that the way we operate in a lot of networks, and even today, is I figure out who you are, I figure out your device, I allow communication. Once that session is allowed, we never check back in until it's closed. And so we have to change that a little bit with Zero Trust. We have to have a way to insert ourselves and be a part of the conversation, conversation being network conversation at all times. In some cases, this is easy to do. In other cases, it's difficult to do. If you look at protocols like SAML and how we integrate with SaaS applications from an authentication and authorization point of view, there's just a timer, and that's all you're left with. So there is no consistent way to insert some form of inspection at all times. It's, well, I've got a timer. If I set it to 60 minutes, I'll check once an hour on this session to make sure nothing's changed. If I set it to 10 minutes, I'm a little bit better. But understand that this is where we get into literal versus the actual way that most organizations are deploying Zero Trust today. Jump back to an organization that actually made this thing work. So with Google Beyond Corp, they essentially spent a lot of time re-architecting the way they do business. And they are a different business, right? Most of their users are developers. Most of their organization has a very specific mission and operation versus some of the public sector organizations that are probably in this room. Their goals that they accomplished were pretty on point, though, from a Zero Trust point of view. If we go back to both Gartner's model, Forrester's model, this follows very similarly what we're trying to do with Zero Trust, which is I want to first start with securely identifying the device. If I don't know what the device is, if I don't know the status of that device, I don't understand whether I should trust it or not. Also, I need to securely identify the user. How do we do this typically? With some form of multi-factor authentication. So username, password, and a Zero Trust world is typically not good enough. I need to actually be able to guarantee it's Jamie who is connecting to this application. The only way I'm going to do that is with more than one factor of auth. Removing trust from the network is important. So being able to understand that this perimeter is gone and I need to allow application access, just like everyone's on the internet, is kind of a key part of the way they did this. And in order to accomplish it, number 4 is the way they accomplished it, which was to externalize all of their apps. So if I'm sitting in an office at Google, it's the same as sitting at Starbucks and being able to access the same applications with or without a VPN and be able to externalize those applications to do my job. And the final part is implement inventory-based access control. So as inventory changes over time, this should also be a part of this. And a fun fact, so Cisco 18 months ago or so acquired a company called Duo. One of the things that Duo does, they have a specific setup and policy model called Duo Beyond. Well, it's modeled directly off of Google's model, and we were the first commercial implementation of this Beyond Corp architecture. Now, when we look at the Google architecture in detail, and hopefully some of you have seen this before, essentially the way they accomplish those 5 items, like I mentioned, 7 years, a lot of money, and a lot of programming that went behind this to make it real, but they were able to take and kind of focus on access proxy, radius, single sign-on, and then getting that trust inference within a device inventory system. So being able to understand who, what, when, where, and how. And then externalizing all those apps to be able to use the context associated with those access requests. Now finally, we kind of see all of these models, and this is kind of a joke on my own company as well as all the probably companies that sit out there that are vendors. As soon as everyone started talking about Zero Trust and see the benefits within some of these breaches that we've actually seen, everyone on the planet now has a Zero Trust product. And the joke is, now that you've seen 15 minutes of these models, there's not a single product out there that will help you or check the box that you have Zero Trust. There is a lot of things working together to be able to achieve Zero Trust architecture. So don't let Cisco or any other company out there tell you, here's a magic shiny box, you implement this thing and you are Zero Trust, because it's not a thing. And that is pretty funny, because you will see marketing coming from so many vendors. Like, I have this magical authentication box, it does Zero Trust for you. It does a part of Zero Trust, and while the journey is as important as the destination here, it's not going to check the architectural box and say you're done. Now, if we look at a true theoretical example of Zero Trust, it kind of can look like this. And some organizations do build their own model. So they have developers just like Google did, and they've started to build some of these boxes here, which from a policy engine point of view, we have a Zero Trust policy engine that's pulling information from a trust engine, and then that trust engine is being delivered or addressed by multiple solutions. This could be patch management, it could be device or user control. All of that information feeds that policy engine that then starts to push out policy to enforcement points throughout a network. Now, all of the same criteria matters here. So perimeterless, deny all access unless explicitly allowed. We need to make sure we address users' devices, applications, services. All of them need to be authenticated, and we need to continually evaluate risk. Now, when we look at that threat-centric versus that trust-centric model, you can start to see today versus where we're trying to go, which is focusing on those main tenets and then trying to make this switch between a time-bound policy to a per-transaction policy. And then finally, getting to dynamic policy is the only way that organizations are going to make this real. If you try to model every user device, application, service manually, that's all you're going to do. I hope you have a team of 50 people just trying to model stuff, because just getting that context around all of the things within IT is a full-time job for many, many people. Now, one of the things that makes this really important is being able to consolidate and work together. So whether it's Cisco doing trust engines and being able to bring in context, I have to work with patch management. I have to work with the endpoint malware software. I have to be able to work with existing tools and put them together in a meaningful way to be able to do authorization based on trust. And for the old school AAA fans, as I gave the difference before, we have to move from a almost radius style authentication and accounting to more of a TACX level style of command authorization. So everything that's done within the IT organization is tracked and authorized prior to being allowed. Now, traditionally, you can look at some organizations, and I've worked with some, that get very, very close to this style of actual access control, but it equates to millions of lines of code within firewalls, millions of lines of access control lists within servers and applications, and is very, very difficult to manage. So at this point, you should hopefully be like, why is this guy telling me Zero Trust is really, really, really hard? And so what can we do today as an industry, as an organization, to actually start that journey with Zero Trust? There are a lot of things. It's really about creating that journey and focusing the efforts. Just getting to the point where you can shift to smaller, more frequent context-based decisions is important. The other thing that helps break it down, and at Cisco we've done this in a meaningful way, is being able to look at different use cases. So starting somewhere easier. For example, focusing on the workforce, workloads, or workplace, and kind of breaking it down into manageable chunks as a part of the journey. Now, what do we mean by shorten, or do smaller, more frequent? Things like timers, SAML token life, .1x authentication timers. How many of you run 802.1x and authenticate users on a network? 1, 2, okay. So all of you hopefully do it on wireless. If you're running wireless, if you're not doing it on wired, that would be another big part of that step, right? Being able to authenticate prior to just allowing a device to come in. Now, also being able to incorporate additional context as a part of firewalls, as a part of the switching data center, cloud infrastructure, all of that stuff matters. Now, as I mentioned, at Cisco, we've kind of broken this apart into 3 main categories, focusing on the workforce, the workloads, and the workplace. Those things do tie together. So a user accessing an application in my public or private cloud is kind of a cross between workforce and workload. The workplace is actually focused on anything, including users, that are connecting to a network that you own. Now, I said, don't trust the network. Workplace is all about creating trust for the users and devices prior to allowing that access. When we break this down, you'll see it actually in 3 logical steps. And so I'm on the Zero Trust working group within Cisco, and one of the challenges we were looking at is, well, how do you apply Zero Trust to these different use cases, workforce, workload, workplace? And what I found was consistently we're trying to do 3 steps every time. And those 3 steps are establish trust. And the way I'm going to establish trust is look at user and device identity. It's going to be looking at device posture and vulnerabilities. Now, when I say device posture, it's things like, is the system up to date? Is antivirus, anti-malware up to date? Does it have the appropriate IT resourced software on there? And then finally, once we have the information associated with that, has it been infected? And that's an interesting point, right? Is we want to go beyond the, does it run my software? Do I trust it from a device and user identity? But also, what is the level of vulnerability so we can evaluate risk? And then 2, have we seen an indication of compromise in the previous day or so to make sure that this thing isn't owned prior to allowing access? Now, once we establish trust, it's all about enforcing trust-based access, and that's all about being able to leverage trust data to create policy. Whether it's on a network, within your application, within the cloud, we have to leverage that data to be able to make a system decision. And then finally, for all of those different use cases, you should be looking at how you continuously verify trust. So once I've allowed access, how do I continually look at whether that user device application is still trusted in my environment? And the best example of that is, I get on my network, I'm starting to access an application, I download malware, and my machine gets owned. How do we actually allow or stop that flow from going after we've already allowed it access on the network? So continuously, we need to check the trust level, the status of all these things. Now, with this, there's steps. So like in Workforce, we're focused on how we do things like multi-factor authentication, how we apply policy and endpoint posture, and then per application visibility. And this is for applications you own, like you've moved an application externally into the cloud or you have it on premise. And it's also about applications that you don't own. So do I have a user going to Box, even though my organization doesn't use Box as a cloud storage company? So being able to control yours and other applications is important. And then one kind of scary note, if you haven't invested in MFA, I don't care what MFA, compromised credentials is kind of the big thing. I mean, the fact of the matter is a part of those phishing attempts, is a part of those breaches, almost all of them include some form of password compromise, and that password compromise ends up allowing for full keys to the kingdom typically. So MFA is a good start for Workforce. With workloads, being able to actually identify applications. So give you a couple examples here. Being able to actually do automated discovery and dependency mapping between one application and another. I had one customer where they were doing this. They had 1,000 applications, and they were accomplishing this process to be able to create a zero trust policy, what should be allowed, and it took them about 3 months every 3 to 4 applications. Once they got to automation, they were able to speed up to about 200 applications in the same time frame. So having some form of automation to be able to identify and customize those apps is super important. And finally, within the workplace, kind of the goal here, and I'm skipping a little bit, you guys will have access to the slides later, just want to have plenty of time for questions. Focusing on how we identify devices. Now, one of the things that I've seen quite a bit is trying to understand IoT from a business point of view. And things have changed quite a bit. It used to be IT bought everything that went on the network, everything that people use from an information technology point of view. Nowadays, we're seeing more and more lines of business or organizational leaders, managers, directors going out and procuring devices that they're just plugging in. So typically, from an IT point of view, we can't say no, but we have to be able to identify the IoT device, understand whether or not we want to trust it or not, before we apply a least privilege policy. And so that moral of the story is we're seeing more and more devices come out of the box with tons and tons of vulnerabilities. Do we want those on our network? Absolutely not. But without the automation to be able to say, hey, Dr. So-and-so plugged this new medical reader into my network, and it has 15 CVE 9.0 and above vulnerabilities on it, and here's how I want to deal with it, you can't make that policy. So visibility and enforcement is kind of the key thing here. A couple closing thoughts. I know I went really heavy on some of the models. The reason why we like to give you that history lesson a little bit is so you see where we've come from. All the way back to 2004, all the way up to today, zero trust architecture's changed quite a bit. The basic premise of least privilege has not changed. How you accomplish least privilege has. There are a lot of solutions out there that can help you on your journey. You do need to focus, though. If you try to boil the ocean, if you try to one day be completely open with a perimeter, soft, chewy inside, and then tomorrow want to be zero trust, it's going to either blow up in your face or it's not going to work unless you kind of change the way you do operations. One other kind of note, don't forget about the IoT devices. There's so many models and organizations that are looking at this problem, and they're focused on the user problem, which is its users accessing applications and how we do zero trust for that. There's just as many non-user devices today as there are user devices, and that ratio is changing. So as you look at zero trust and how you do it, think about all of the devices that don't have a user behind it and how you will deal with those devices. And then finally, like I mentioned, shift to the smaller contextual-based operations. Even if it's just changing your firewall from being IP-based over to user-based or focused on applications. That's a step forward. Many organizations are starting top-down with Zero Trust, though. They're looking at how they get to that end goal 3 to 5 years from now, and what are the steps within that journey that they can take. Biggest example that I think is the most powerful is in the data center. So most data centers and applications today have a control on what users can get in, but there's very limited restrictions and segmentation between those applications. So once me as a bad guy attacks and owns one application, I can typically get everywhere once I have ownership in that data center. With that, I think we've got plenty of time for questions, comments, concerns.